mother of three disappears after New Year's Eve. Her husband says she left early that morning for a work trip in Washington, D.C. At first, it sounds believable, but police can't confirm the flight, the rideshare, or even that she ever made it to the airport. Then investigators uncover cleanup supplies, trash disposal runs, DNA evidence, and disturbing Google searches about how long it takes a body to smell. And somehow, prosecutors say they solved Ana Walshe's murder without ever finding her body. And the deeper you go into this case, the stranger it gets, because the investigation wasn't built around one massive piece of evidence. It was built piece by piece. A timeline reconstructed through surveillance footage, digital evidence, contradictions, forensic recovery, and the argument that someone wasn't just hiding a crime, but trying to erase it completely. This is a Case Trace Society file, where we break down what's said, what's known, and what still leaves people questioning what really happened. Ana Walshe was born on April 12, 1983. Originally from what was then Yugoslavia, she later immigrated to the United States in 2005, and she then became a dual citizen. And by all accounts, Ana was building a successful life. She worked in real estate, eventually becoming a regional general manager at Tishman Speyer in 2022. People described her as driven, social, intelligent, and deeply focused on her future. She met Brian Walshe around 2015, and the two married in 2016. Together, they had 3 sons, who were just 2, 4, and 6 when Ana disappeared. And from the outside, their life looked stable. Successful careers, a large home in Cohasset, Massachusetts, 3 children, a future that looked established. But later, investigators would begin uncovering signs that things behind the scenes may not have been nearly as stable as they appeared. Long before Ana vanished, Brian Walshe was already dealing with major legal problems. In 2021, he pleaded guilty in a federal fraud case involving fake Andy Warhol paintings. According to prosecutors, he had sold fraudulent artwork while presenting it as authentic. And at the time Ana disappeared, Brian was on house arrest waiting to be sentenced. And prosecutors would later argue that financial pressure, legal stress, and possible relationship issues inside the marriage became important parts of the bigger picture. There were also reports that Ana had discussed separation. And according to reporting surrounding the investigation, Ana reportedly carried a life insurance policy worth around $2.7 million. Now, obviously, having financial problems or marital issues doesn't automatically mean someone becomes violent. But once investigators started looking at the timeline after Ana vanished, those details suddenly carried a very different weight. The last publicly known sightings of Ana began around New Year's Eve 2022. Ana and Brian reportedly spent part of the evening with a family friend, and at the time, nothing outwardly seemed unusual. No emergency calls, no reports of violence, nothing publicly that suggested this would become one of the most talked about homicide cases in recent years. But looking back, that night would become one of the final confirmed windows in which Ana was known to be alive. According to reporting and testimony, Ana also tried to contact her mother, her sister, and her best friend, who was also her maid of honor at her wedding, shortly after midnight on New Year's, but none of them answered. And honestly, that part hits a little different once you know how the story ends, because investigators believe that those calls may have happened during the final known stretch before Ana disappeared completely. And now, those missed calls feel less like routine contact and more like moments frozen right before everything changed. Brian initially told investigators that Ana had left the house early on January 1st for a work emergency in Washington, D.C. According to him, she left for Logan International Airport using a rideshare service. And at first, that explanation sounds reasonable. Ana traveled for work. A sudden trip wasn't impossible, and nothing immediately sounded alarming. But the more that police checked the story, the less of it they could actually verify. Investigators reportedly could not confirm a rideshare pickup, airport footage showing Ana arriving, evidence that she boarded a flight, or proof that she ever made it to Washington, D.C. And that's when the investigation starts shifting fast, because now police aren't trying to find someone who missed a flight. They're trying to figure out whether she ever left the house at all. As investigators continued interviewing Brian, they reportedly began identifying inconsistencies in his timeline. Brian also claimed that he spent January 1st with his mother in Swampscott, but prosecutors later alleged surveillance footage and phone data contradicted parts of that account. This is really where suspicion starts building, because investigations like this, it's usually not one thing that changes everything. It's when multiple small things stop lining up at the same time. A timeline changes, a location can't be verified, or a story shifts slightly after new evidence appears. And according to prosecutors, that's exactly what started happening here. Then, investigators began tracing Brian's movements after Ana disappeared, and according to them, those movements raised major red flags. Prosecutors alleged Brian traveled to stores including Lowe's, where he purchased things like cleaning supplies, buckets, mops, tarps, protective materials, a hacksaw, and wire snips. According to prosecutors, the purchases totaled over $400, and surveillance footage reportedly documented portions of those trips. Now, on their own, those items don't automatically prove murder, but when investigators started placing those purchases beside the missing timeline, the changing statements, and what was later recovered, the case started looking very different. Investigators also reportedly discovered that Brian had not actually gone to CVS or Whole Foods with his mother, despite his earlier claims suggesting he had. And moments like that became important because police started realizing they weren't just dealing with missing information. They were allegedly dealing with information that wasn't true. Then the investigation took yet another major turn. Investigators reportedly recovered evidence from dumpsters across multiple locations. According to those prosecutors, some of those items tested positive for DNA connected to Ana Walshe, and prosecutors argued the disposal activity itself suggested deliberate concealment. Some of the disposal activity was also reportedly connected to areas near Brian's mother's residence. And honestly, this is the point where the case starts feeling deeply disturbing, because now investigators aren't just describing suspicious behavior. They're allegedly recovering evidence tied directly to Ana during what prosecutors say were disposal efforts. Then prosecutors revealed one of the most disturbing parts of the case: Google searches allegedly connected to Brian Walshe, including searches such as how long before a body starts to smell, dismemberment and the best ways to dispose of a body, can you be charged with murder without a body, and how to clean blood stains. Investigators also alleged that some searches were conducted across multiple devices, including one associated with his son's iPad. And when people heard those searches for the first time, it completely changed how many viewed the case. Because suddenly, the prosecution's theory didn't feel abstract anymore. It felt specific. And prosecutors argued those searches lined up directly with the purchases, the disposal activity, and the reconstructed timeline investigators had been building. One of the biggest things that people miss about the Ana Walshe case is that investigators were allegedly building a murder case without ever recovering Ana's body, which completely changes how a case gets reconstructed. Instead of one definitive crime scene, investigators had to piece together behavior, digital evidence, forensics, surveillance, movements, and contradictions. And prosecutors argued that the concealment itself became evidence, not one massive smoking gun, but dozens of details pointing in the same direction. Investigators reportedly interviewed Brian multiple times during that investigation, and according to prosecutors, parts of his story evolved as more evidence was recovered, which is something investigators pay very close attention to, because when timelines start changing after evidence appears, police immediately start asking, was the original story incomplete or intentionally misleading? And prosecutors argued that Brian's changing explanations became part of a broader pattern that they were documenting. Then came the arrest. On January 18th, 2023, Brian Walshe was arrested, and his initial charges included misleading police investigators and improper conveyance or disposal of a human body. And even then, the wording of the charges told the public something important. Investigators already believed that Ana was dead, despite not recovering her body, which made the case feel even more unsettling, because prosecutors were essentially arguing the evidence itself revealed what happened. On March 30th, Brian Walshe was indicted on charges including first-degree murder, misleading investigators, and improper conveyance of a human body. By that point, prosecutors argued the evidence formed a clear reconstruction of murder and concealment. The defense continued arguing the case remained circumstantial, especially because Ana's body was never recovered, and legally, that mattered, because prosecutors now had to convince a jury that the totality of evidence, taken together, proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Later that year, on November 19, 2025, Brian changed his plea regarding the lesser charges. He pleaded guilty to misleading the investigators and the improper disposal of a human body. But while he still maintained innocence on the murder charge itself, which was another huge point of public discussion, because people immediately started asking, if he admitted to misleading investigators and improper disposal activity, then what exactly was he saying happened? On December 15, 2025, Brian Walshe was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Ana Walshe. 3 days later, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And according to courtroom reporting, Brian allegedly stated that Ana turned up dead in bed, which only intensified public discussion around the case, because even after conviction, people were still trying to piece together the exact sequence of events that prosecutors argued happened inside that home. As of late 2025, Ana and Brian's children were last publicly reported to be in the care of the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families. And honestly, that may be one of the saddest parts of the entire case, because underneath all the headlines, all the evidence, all the court proceedings, 3 children lost both parents in completely different ways. And maybe that's part of what makes this case stay with people. Not just the allegation of murder, but the way investigators say they uncovered the truth afterward. The searches, the purchases, the surveillance, the contradictions, the disposal activity, the timeline changes. A homicide case prosecutors argued was reconstructed from what someone was allegedly trying to erase. And whether people agree with every part of the prosecution's theory or not, the sheer amount of detail investigators say they uncovered is what transformed this from a missing persons case into one of the most disturbing true crime investigations in recent years. Because sometimes what's missing says more than what's found.